Hey kids, it's Pastor Brian again. We're going to continue reading through our book called The Promise of Life, a big story about God's law. We've already heard about Adam and Eve, and we've heard about Abraham and about Israel and their freedom from Egypt and coming into the land. But if you'll remember, all of Israel, both in Egypt and in the new land, the Israelites were still slaves to sin. They couldn't obey the law, even though it promised life. So now we're at part 4, the witness to life. Let's see in here, here's a picture of a goat in 3 scriptures. Moreover, I gave them statutes that were not good and rules by which they could not have life. Ezekiel 20:25. Now we know that whatever the law says, it speaks to those who are under the law, so that every mouth may be stopped, and the whole world may be held accountable to God. Romans 3:19. For the life of the flesh is in the blood, and I have given it for you on the altar to make atonement for your souls. For it is the blood that makes atonement by the life. Leviticus 17, verse 11. Part 4, the witness to life. God knew that the Israelites were slaves to sin. He knew that they would not be able to obey His law to find life. So, why did God give Israel His law? God gave Israel His law to teach them that they were slaves to sin. God wanted Israel to cry out to Him, to be set free from their slavery just like they did in Egypt. But Israel is not the only one with a serious problem. God's law shows that every person in the world is a slave to sin and under the curse of the law. All people need to cry out to God to set them free from their slavery to sin. God's law promised life, but no one will find life by obeying God's law. Life with God must come in some other way. People are still slaves to sin, still disobeying. God's law actually taught about this other way, the only way to have blessed life with God. God's law taught that people received God's blessing for trusting God's great promises. God's law taught that those who repent from sin and turn to God would be set free from their slavery to sin. God's law taught that those who confess their sins to God would be forgiven and healed. What did Abraham do? Abraham trusted God's promise. We see that God will free His people from slavery to sin when they repent and trust God's promises. God's law taught that someone else must die to take away the curse of the law so that others might live. God's law taught that someone else must die far away from God for others to have life with God. The priest was sacrificing this lamb. And every year, on the Day of Atonement, they would have to send away a goat into the wilderness, far away from the land and God's people. Why? God had made a great promise to Abraham to bless him and make him into a great people living in a land that was full of life. God had also promised that He would bless the world through Abraham's family. But Abraham's family, Israel, had disobeyed God. Israel did not bring God's blessing to the world. Had God forgotten His great promise? No! God always keeps His promises. After Israel had lost life with God and their land, God promised that He was going to do something new and something better. God's new and better promise was that one day He would set His people free. not from slavery to Egypt, but from their slavery to sin. God's new and better promise was that one day he would write his law not on stone tablets, but on his people's hearts. What were the hearts of the people of Israel looking like before, when they were slaves to sin? You remember that their hearts were here, but there was a snake wrapped around it. But what does the picture say now? God would give them a new heart that had his law written on them. God's new and better promise was that one day he would live with his people, not in a temple, but he would walk among them. God's new and better promise was that one day he would take away the curse of the law, so people would have life forever. This great promise was not just for Israel. Just as God had said to Abraham long ago, he promised that this blessing would come to all peoples in the world, and this blessing would come through someone in Abraham's family. And that's it for part 4. Part 5 coming up is the gift of life. I hope you guys are enjoying it.